Okay, we're going to begin today with the Americas, and we're going to focus in on, first of all, the Andean Mountains, and then the second lecture we'll be talking about the Mesoamerican civilizations. And if you look at the map there, you're going to see it. The two main civilization areas, main urban areas in the Americas, pre-Columbian. There are also a few other urban civilizations that were out there, the Mississippian. There's some towns in what we would now call the southwest of the United States. But for the most part, really, if you're going to talk about urban civilizations, those are the two areas. The Americas in general are different from the other civilizations we've talked about for a set of reasons, most of which come down to the first, which is they're separate from the other continents. It may be that some people from one other continent ended up stranded and came to in some way, ended up on the Americas. But for the overwhelming majority, there was no contact between the Americas and Australia. I'm sorry. There was no contact between the Americas and Europe and Asia and Africa. And so as civilization developed in the Americas in isolation, separate from those other places. And that's very different from the kind of back and forth trading between the other three continents that took place. No domesticated animals. There are some exceptions, but there's not a lot of them. Llamas, which you're seeing in that picture right there, looking down at the ruins of an Incan city. So they had llamas in the Andes Mountain region. Andes Mountains, they also bred guinea pigs for eating. Dogs, which probably came over from Asia with the first humans, and maybe turkeys or something like that for Mesoamerica. But that's really it. No other forms of domesticated animals. Partly because of that, very few contagious diseases existed. Because one of the ways in which we get contagious diseases as we trade them back and forth between us and our domesticated animals. And so without that was one thing that helped protect them against developing contagious diseases. Also, we tend to develop those a great deal in major urban areas rather than isolated villages because of the crowding, because of the pollution, because of all those things. And once again, that wasn't really the case in the Americas. And then finally, another thing that helped with the development of contagious diseases is trading them back and forth across a distance. So Europe, Africa, and Asia were all trading diseases between them, and that helped them spread and helped to sort of increase the repertoire of diseases that were there, and that just wasn't going to be the case for the Americas. Finally, the Americas were incredibly culturally diverse in languages, in cultural practices, in every way you want to name it. And so that's a final distinctive thing. Andean civilizations, we'll talk about them first. And there's the Andes Mountains. Trade across environmental zones is really the characteristic that defined the civilizations that developed in the Andes. And you're seeing why that would be so right there. You're looking up at the mountains, and then you've got the level below that, the green land below that. And that's sort of that kind of contrast between the different zones. That's true across the Andes. And so if you want to survive, they had to basically take advantage of the resources that the different areas offered. And so the way it would work is, if you look at this sort of diagram, the purple, that represents the coastal areas, and that was a great source of fish and assorted things that came from the ocean. Then you have the highlands, that's moving up from the coast up onto the mountains, not the top of the mountains obviously, but as you move up that in those higher areas, and you could grow potatoes there, you could grow root vegetables. And then on the other side of the mountains, you've got the Amazonian forests, and they're a source through trade of fruit, sweet potatoes, pineapples, manioc, And then finally, as time went on, one of the distinctive things about the Americas is the civilizations there didn't start in river valleys. However, farmers on the Andean farmers did figure out that the river valley could be very useful, and so you see down just below where the Pacific coast is marked, you'll see an example of a river meeting the edge of the ocean, and those river valleys, that one, others like it, become places where farmers discover that they can specialize and grow a great many different crops, including cotton, squash, cocoa, chili peppers, eventually maize, which they got through trade from Mesoamerica, all those different kinds of resources. So you could have a really rich diet living in the Andean area as long as you were getting food from a variety of places. So what they had to do was link these zones, and the way that traditionally that was done was through what was called the Ayu, the clan, which held land collectively. And the thing about the Ayu is it would extend across ecological zones. So in your clan, you would have people at the coast, you would have people on the other side down by the forest, you would have people in the highlands, and therefore it made it easy for you to exchange resources and make trusted contacts exchanging resources across the climatic zones and sort of making it the resources that were needed for the individual families. The IU would also act as the connection between individuals and the government at the times where you had civilizations in existence. They would manage the mita. Basically, instead of being taxed as an individual like you would be here, what would happen is you would be taxed, the IU would be taxed, and would have the responsibility to provide goods, but also to provide workers for projects like building roads. And the IU would pay as a whole, and so you might, for example, be picked as the person who this year was going to go to do road work, while other members of your IU wouldn't until the next time. Gender roles. It's going to sound fairly familiar. Men were for hunting, men were for warfare, men were for government, women for weaving, farming, and home. And so you'll notice there that there was that sort of gender division. And you can sort of see some of that illustrated here with the different tasks that women are doing and the amount of their time that was devoted to weaving in particular. The woman on the top left and the woman next to her, they're spinning. They're making a cord, and then the woman on the bottom right is actually weaving it. Textiles in particular were hugely important. They were used for clothing, of course, and other forms of goods. Having particularly well-made textiles could be a great sign of status. It was one of the forms of artwork. Cords were used for record keeping. Quipus were basically not having a written language. Instead, they used a series of knotted cords as a way of keeping track of money, records, food, various things like that. So record keeping was done with cords made from textiles in essence. You could use fibers. Fibers were used for building roofs. They were used for building bridges, just about everywhere. And it was actually the Andean peoples were one of the first cases that people actually developed cloth, textiles, before they developed pottery, just to show how important it was for them. The first of the big Andean civilizations was Chauvin, about 1000 to 200 BCE. The thing about Chauvin was that it depended on basically making itself a source of attraction, drawing people to it, rather than depending on actually trying to force people to be part of their civilization. So they didn't conquer people, they didn't bring people in by force, but they tried to attract them. One way was that Chauvin was a center of trade, and that was encouraged by the fact that they domesticated llamas, which made it easier for long-distance trade, and Chauvin emphasized road building to make that even easier. So that was one way of attracting people. Even more importantly, Chauvin was a pilgrimage center. It was a place of worship. And so people would come on pilgrimages. A pilgrimage is a religious journey to the shrine at Chauvin to worship, to see the ceremonies, the performances by the shaman priests, which were apparently extremely elaborate, extremely well designed. And shaman, by the way, when we talk about shaman, we're talking about people who have the power, it's believed, to communicate with the spirit world in various ways. In the case of this shamanism, the focus would be on transformation from a human to an animal to a supernatural being and back again. And sort of the shaman is the one who, through these apparent transformations, spiritual transformations, is able to link these different levels of reality and make Chauvin a place of power that people are attracted to. The biggest of the Andean empires was actually the Incan Empire, which came much later, 1438 to 1533. It was an incredibly powerful empire, and you're looking at there one of the ruins of one of the cities that they built. The center of the Incas was the emperor, the ruler, who had to prove himself through his ability to conquer, to rule, to fight. He would engage in ritual offerings. He would make ritual offerings to the various he would make ritual offerings as a way of showing his spiritual power, his acting as a linkage for his empire. But he also had to actually prove that he could fight. They used local rulers, the heads of the ayllus, to sort of control and rule over local people. But one thing they actually did was they broke the traditional ayllus. So they took them apart and replaced them with ayllus that they created themselves. So they're working with the ayllus, they're trying to use them, but at the same time, they pretty much gutted them to make them more obedient to the emperor rather than their traditional connections. The Incas hugely invested in building up and developing their road system. And you can see that by just looking at that map. All those little black lines on there are the road systems built by the Inca. And there's actually some of it still remains today, which you can see in the picture on the left, an Incan road. That allowed them to connect people. It made it easier to send trade goods, food, but also to send military troops and make combat easier as well in terms of getting soldiers from one place to another. When the Spanish come in and conquer, by the way, one of the problems they face with the Incan roads is, if you'll notice, they're all stairs. And that works just fine if what you're riding is llamas, because llamas can climb stairs. But when you're riding horses can't climb stairs like that. And so these amazing road system, from the point of view of the Spanish when they come in to conquer, is pretty much useless. The Inca used a variety of ways of trying to link the empire together. Trade across the empire, supported and enforced by the military. Using public warehouses to build up surpluses so that in any case of famine, disease, epidemics, not disease and epidemics, in case of famine or other kinds of problems, they would be able to send food, resources to the places that were in need, sort of a social safety net. Keeping records, quipus, and you can actually see somebody holding an example of a quipu up in the upper left. All of these things are ways that they helped keep the empire linked together. And in fact, by having the resources to try to help in times of famine, and they also provided additional support to the destitute, to the very aged, it's probably one of the more sort of innovative social welfare approaches at the time. Of course, the end of the Incas is the Spanish conquest, and By the time that the Spanish come in, they've already been weakened. The Inca have been weakened by civil war. One of the problems by demanding that your emperor proves himself as a general, as a person who can lead people into war, it tends to encourage people to think about going to war as a way of proving themselves worthy of being empire. And in this case, that's sort of what had happened. They'd had epidemics that were being brought with the Spanish. You'll learn more about that in next semester. And they had had rebellions against them from the Seljuk people. And that was the end of the Incan Empire.